My father sold me to his drug dealer for $200. Years later, he showed up at my wedding asking for money. I was 7 years old when my father traded me to his dealer like I was a bag of groceries. Today, he showed up at my wedding demanding I pay him back for raising me. Growing up, I thought every kid got passed around between strangers when their parents needed something. My earliest memory is sitting in a car outside a gas station while my dad argued with someone through the window. The man kept pointing at me and shaking his head. "She's smart," my dad kept saying. "Real smart. She can earn it back in no time." I didn't understand what they were talking about then. I thought Dad was bragging about my kindergarten report card. The man finally nodded and handed my dad some money. Dad looked relieved as he unbuckled my seatbelt. "You're going to stay with Uncle Rick for a while," Dad said, not meeting my eyes. "Be good." Uncle Rick wasn't my uncle. He was a stranger who lived in a basement apartment that smelled like cigarettes and something else I couldn't identify. He had 3 other kids there already, all around my age, all scared and quiet. Rick made us work. We sorted pills into bags, counted money, and delivered packages around the neighborhood. If we messed up, we didn't eat. If we tried to leave, Rick would show us the pictures he'd taken of our real families and threaten to hurt them. I stayed with Rick for 2 years. 2 years of eating crackers for dinner, sleeping on a mattress with 3 other kids, and learning that the world was full of people who saw children as products instead of people. The police raid happened on a Tuesday morning. I was sitting at the kitchen table sorting white pills when the door exploded inward. Officers in black gear shouted commands while Rick tried to flush evidence down the toilet. They found us in the back bedroom, 4 kids aged 6 to 9, all underfed and terrified. I remember one officer kneeling down to my level and asking my name. I told her, and she wrote it on her notepad with hands that shook slightly. The social worker who came later explained that my father had been arrested 3 months earlier. He'd been in jail while I lived with Rick, never once asking about me or trying to get me back. He'd signed papers giving up his parental rights rather than face additional charges. Sometimes, the social worker said gently, parents make choices that show they're not ready to be parents. I was placed with the Martinez family, foster parents who ran a small farm outside the city. Elena and Carlos had 3 biological children and a house full of foster kids who'd aged out but came back for holidays. For the first month, I barely spoke. I hoarded food under my bed and flinched when anyone raised their voice. Elena would sit with me at bedtime, reading stories and never pushing me to talk until I was ready. "You're safe now, mija," she'd whisper. "No one here will hurt you." Slowly, I began to believe her. I learned what it felt like to eat 3 meals a day, to sleep in my own bed, to have adults who checked on me because they cared, not because they wanted something from me. I excelled in school, partly because learning felt like freedom after years of being treated like property. Teachers noticed my hunger for knowledge and started giving me extra books to read at home. By middle school, I was accelerated 2 grade levels. My foster siblings cheered at every award ceremony, every honor roll announcement. Carlos taught me to fix cars in his garage, saying every person should know how to be self-sufficient. "Your brain is your most powerful tool," Elena would tell me while helping with homework. "No one can ever take that away from you." High school brought scholarship opportunities. I applied to colleges with Elena and Carlos's help, writing essays about overcoming adversity and finding strength in unexpected places. Their pride in my achievements felt foreign but wonderful. I graduated as valedictorian and got a full ride to State University. On graduation day, Elena cried while Carlos took pictures with a camera he'd bought specifically for the occasion. "We're so proud of you, mija," Elena said, adjusting my cap. "You've shown us what resilience looks like." College was a fresh start where no one knew my history. I studied social work, driven by memories of the caseworker who'd saved me from Rick's basement. I wanted to be that person for other kids trapped in situations they couldn't escape. I met David during my sophomore year. He was studying engineering and had the kind of steady, calm personality that made me feel grounded. We studied together, shared dreams about the future, and he never pushed when I struggled to talk about my childhood. "Everyone has a past," he'd say when I apologized for being guarded. "What matters is who you're choosing to become." We dated through college and got engaged after graduation. David proposed at the Martinez farm during Christmas dinner, in front of the family who'd shown me what love actually looked like. Planning our wedding felt surreal. Elena insisted on making my dress, spending months on intricate beadwork that caught the light like stars. Carlos walked me through father-daughter dance tutorials, saying every bride deserved someone proud to walk her down the aisle. The guest list was small but meaningful. Foster siblings who'd become real siblings, college friends who'd supported me through difficult classes, colleagues from my job at Child Protective Services, people who'd chosen to love me, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. 3 days before the wedding, my phone rang. Unknown number with a local area code. "Hello, sweetheart," a voice said when I answered. "It's your dad." I sat down hard in my office chair. I hadn't heard from him in 15 years, not since the day he'd traded me to Rick like a commodity. "I don't have a dad," I said quietly. "Now that's not true," he laughed like we were sharing a joke. "I heard through the grapevine that you're getting married. Thought I should congratulate you." I hung up immediately and blocked the number, but something cold had settled in my stomach. How had he found me? How did he know about the wedding? David found me crying in our apartment that evening. I told him about the call, about the memories it had triggered, about the fear that my past would somehow contaminate our future. "He can't hurt you anymore," David said firmly. "You're not that scared, little girl. You're a woman who saves other children from people like him." I almost believed him. The wedding day dawned perfect. Clear skies, gentle breeze, the smell of Elena's famous tomato tamales drifting from the kitchen. I felt beautiful in the dress she'd created, surrounded by people who'd helped me become who I was meant to be. Carlos looked distinguished in his rented tuxedo as he prepared to walk me down the aisle. "Ready, mija?" he asked, offering his arm. The ceremony was everything I'd dreamed of. David's vows made me cry. Elena sobbed through the entire exchange. My foster siblings cheered when we kissed, and for a moment, the little girl who'd survived Rick's basement felt completely healed. During the reception, I was dancing with David when I saw him. He stood at the edge of the dance floor, older and thinner than I remembered, but unmistakably the man who'd sold me for drug money 15 years earlier. He wore an ill-fitting suit and had the hollow-eyed look of someone still using. I froze mid-dance. David followed my gaze and immediately stepped between us. "That's him," I whispered. "That's my father." Carlos appeared beside us within seconds, having noticed the disruption. "Want me to call security?" he asked quietly. Before I could answer, my biological father started walking toward us. Guests stopped dancing as he approached, sensing the sudden tension in the room. "There's my beautiful daughter," he said loudly, arms spread like he expected a hug. "Don't I get a dance with the bride?" "You need to leave," David said firmly. "Now." "Whoa, calm down there, son," my father said, that same manipulative charm I remembered from childhood. "I just want to congratulate my little girl. Haven't seen her since she was tiny." "You sold me," I said, my voice carrying further than I intended. Several guests gasped. "You traded me to a drug dealer for $200. His mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something ugly underneath. Then he smiled again, addressing the crowd like they were his audience. "Kids remember things differently than they happened," he announced. "I was going through a rough patch, sure, but I did what I thought was best for her. Look how good she turned out." Elena appeared at my side, fury radiating from her small frame. "You need to leave my daughter's wedding immediately," she said in the voice she reserved for her most difficult moments. "Your daughter?" He laughed. "I think there's been some confusion. This is my kid, my blood. I raised her until she was 7, and now she owes me." "Owes you what?" Carlos stepped forward, and I realized half the wedding party had formed a protective circle around me. "Well, she's obviously done well for herself," my father gestured at the reception. "College education, fancy job, nice wedding. I figure I deserve some compensation for my investment in her early years." The audacity stole my breath. He was demanding payment for the childhood he'd stolen from me, for the trauma he'd caused, for trading me like property. "Your investment." Elena's voice was deadly quiet. "You mean when you gave her to a drug dealer who made her count pills and threatened to kill her family if she tried to escape?" Murmurs rippled through the guests. My father's smile faltered as he realized the crowd wasn't buying his performance. "That's not how it happened," he protested. "Rick was just a babysitter. I needed someone to watch her while I got back on my feet. For 2 years?" David's voice cut through the lies. "You left her there for 2 years while you were in prison." My father's facade cracked completely. "She's being dramatic. Kids exaggerate. I'm her father, and I deserve respect." "You're not her father," Carlos said, producing something from his jacket pocket. "I am." He showed the adoption papers we'd finalized just last month. Elena and Carlos had officially adopted me as an adult, giving me the legal family bond that matched our emotional one. My biological father stared at the documents like they were written in a foreign language. "That's impossible. You can't just steal someone's kid. You gave up your parental rights 15 years ago," I said, finding my voice again. "You chose drugs over your daughter. These people chose to love me when you threw me away." Security finally arrived, alerted by one of David's groomsmen. My father looked around the circle of people protecting me, realizing he had no allies here. "This isn't over," he said as security escorted him toward the exit. "Blood is blood. You owe me for your life." "I owe you nothing," I called after him. "But I'll pray you find the help you need." The reception resumed slowly. Guests approached me throughout the evening, sharing their own stories of overcoming difficult families, of finding chosen family when biological family failed them. Mrs. Chen, Elena's neighbor, pulled me aside during dinner. "I was in the camps during the war," she said quietly. "Lost my whole family. Found a new one here. Family isn't who shares your blood. It's who shows up when you need them." David's grandmother, sharp as a tack at 92, cornered me by the cake table. "That man is poison," she declared. "You've built something beautiful despite him, not because of him. Don't let him dim your light." One of my foster siblings, Maria, now a nurse practitioner, found me during the bouquet toss. "Remember when you first came to us?" she asked. "You used to hide crackers in your pockets during meals. Look at you now, surrounded by people who would do anything for you." I threw the bouquet to my youngest foster sister, who caught it with a grin. She was starting college in the fall, planning to study education. The cycle of healing continued. During our last dance, David held me close as we swayed to our wedding song. "Are you okay?" he whispered. I looked around the room at the people who'd shaped me into who I was. Elena and Carlos dancing together after 30 years of marriage. My foster siblings laughing at some shared memory. Friends from college and work celebrating with genuine joy. "I'm perfect," I said, and meant it. We honeymooned in Costa Rica, far from anything that could remind me of the past. We zip-lined through rainforests, snorkeled in crystal clear water, and spent hours talking about our future. On our last night, while David slept beside me, I thought about the 7-year-old girl who'd been traded for drug money. She'd survived Rick's basement, thrived with the Martinez family, and built a life worth celebrating. My father had shown up demanding payment for damage he'd caused, but looking at my wedding ring in the moonlight, I realized I had already paid him back. I'd succeeded despite his failures, loved despite his abandonment, and created a family that would never trade me for anything. The best revenge wasn't destruction. It It was healing. It was becoming someone who protected other children from the monsters that had hurt me. It was building something beautiful from the wreckage he'd created. 6 months after the wedding, I got a letter from my father. He was in rehab, court-ordered after another arrest. The letter was full of apologies and promises, requests for money and attention. I read it once and threw it away. Some people deserved second chances. He wasn't one of them. But I kept a photo from our wedding day on my desk at work. Elena and Carlos walking me down the aisle, their faces shining with pride. It reminded me every day that family was something you built, not something you inherited. And every child I helped find safety, every family I reunited, every case I closed successfully was my real payment to the universe. Not because I owed anyone anything, but because love multiplies when you give it away. The little girl who'd been sold for $200 had grown into a woman who was priceless. And that was the only accounting that mattered. But the story doesn't end there. The confrontation at my wedding was just the beginning. 2 weeks into our honeymoon, David's phone rang at 3 a.m. It was Elena, her voice shaking with anger and fear. "Mija, you need to know what's happening here," she said when David handed me the phone. "Your biological father has been calling reporters, trying to sell his story." My stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" "He's claiming we kidnapped you from him when you were 7. He told Channel 7 News that rich white people stole his daughter and brainwashed you against him. He wants money to tell his side of the story." I sat on the edge of our hotel bed in Costa Rica, watching the sunrise through our window, and felt the familiar cold fear creeping back in. "There's more," Elena continued. "He found our address somehow. He's been sitting in a car outside our house, watching. The neighbors are getting scared." David immediately started looking up flights home, but Elena insisted we stay and finish our honeymoon. She and Carlos had already contacted their lawyer and filed for a restraining order. "You've worked too hard to let him steal your joy," Elena said firmly. "We'll handle this. You focus on being happy." But happiness felt impossible with my past reaching across an ocean to threaten my present. When we returned home, I found my father's version of events spreading across local social media. He'd given interviews to 3 news stations, painted himself as a grieving father whose child had been stolen by the system. His story was compelling if you didn't know the truth. A young single father struggling with addiction, trying to get clean, loses his daughter to wealthy foster parents who turn her against him. He'd even found old photos of us together from when I was very young, before the worst abuse started. "Systemic racism," he told one reporter. "They took my daughter because I was poor and Hispanic, gave her to rich white people who could afford lawyers." The fact that Elena and Carlos were also Hispanic didn't fit his narrative, so he simply didn't mention it. Comments poured in supporting him. People who'd never met either of us decided I was an ungrateful daughter who'd abandoned her father for money. The local news Facebook pages filled with strangers calling me heartless. My work phone started ringing with reporters wanting my side of the story. My supervisor, Mrs. Rodriguez, called me into her office with a concerned expression. "I know this is personal," she said gently, "but these allegations could impact your work with families. Some people might question your judgment about parental rights." I felt like throwing up. Years of education, training, and successful cases were being threatened by a man who'd sold me to a drug dealer. That evening, David found me crying over my laptop, reading comment after comment from strangers who believed my father's lies. "They don't know you," he said, closing the laptop firmly. "The people who matter know the truth." But the damage was spreading. My father had hired a lawyer, some personal injury attorney who specialized in family reunification cases. They were threatening to sue Elena and Carlos for alienation of affection, claiming they'd turned me against my biological father. The lawyer sent a letter demanding $100,000 in damages, or they'd file suit and take the case to court. They wanted medical records, therapy notes, anything that could support their narrative of a stolen child. Elena and Carlos were devastated. They'd spent their life savings helping kids like me, and now they were facing bankruptcy because they'd loved me enough to protect me. "We'll fight this," Carlos said during a family meeting. "We have documentation from your case file, the police reports from Rick's arrest, the records of your father signing away his rights." But legal battles cost money they didn't have. And even if we won, the publicity was damaging our family's reputation in the community. That's when something unexpected happened. Maria, my foster sister, who was now a nurse, had been quietly reaching out to the other kids who'd been at Rick's house during the raid 15 years earlier. She'd found 2 of them through Facebook, both adults now with their own families. Jake was 26, working construction in Arizona. He remembered everything: the pills, the packages, the threats. When Maria explained what my father was claiming, Jake was furious. "That man didn't lose his daughter," Jake told Maria over the phone. "He sold her, just like he sold me." The second person Maria found was Sarah, now a teacher in California. She'd been at Rick's house for 3 years, from age 6 to 9. Her father had also been arrested for drug-related charges and had signed over parental rights rather than face additional charges. Both Jake and Sarah were willing to testify about what had really happened at Rick's house. They'd been old enough to understand that their parents had essentially sold them, not lost them to an unfair system. With their testimony, we had witnesses who could prove my father was lying about his version of events, but we needed more. That's when Mrs. Chen, Elena's elderly neighbor, surprised us all. She'd been following the news coverage and was furious about the lies being spread. Mrs. Chen had survived the Chinese Cultural Revolution and had a particular hatred for people who twisted truth for personal gain. "I kept records," she told us one evening, producing a box of notebooks from her closet. "I document everything that happens in this neighborhood. I have been writing down who comes and goes for 20 years. Her notebooks contained detailed observations from my early years with Elena and Carlos, dates when I'd started speaking again, notes about my nightmares gradually decreasing, records of my academic progress. But most importantly, she had documented every time my biological father had been in the neighborhood over the years. He came by 4 times, Mrs. Chen read from her neat handwriting, never knocked on the door, never tried to see the girl, just sat in his car and watched, then he would leave. She had license plate numbers, dates, times, proof that my father had known where I was living but had chosen not to pursue contact until it became financially beneficial. Armed with this evidence, our lawyer scheduled a press conference. Elena and Carlos sat beside me as I read a prepared statement to local media. I detailed the true timeline of events, my father's drug addiction, the 2 years I'd spent with Rick, the police raid that had saved my life. I showed reporters the police report from Rick's arrest, which clearly stated that I'd been living there for 2 years. My biological father signed away his parental rights in 2008, I said, holding up the documents. He chose drugs over his daughter. The Martinez family chose love over convenience when they opened their home to a traumatized child. Jake and Sarah appeared via video call from their respective states, corroborating my story and sharing their own experiences at Rick's house. The most powerful moment came when Elena spoke. "We didn't steal anyone's daughter," she said, her voice steady despite her tears. "We gave a broken child a place to heal. We celebrated every small victory. Every night she slept without nightmares. Every A on her report card. We loved her because she deserved love, not because we wanted something from her." The press conference changed the narrative completely. Within hours, my father's supporters began questioning his story. The comment sections that had been filled with criticism of me now contained messages of support. Local news stations interviewed child welfare experts who explained the difference between family preservation and child protection. They clarified that children aren't removed from families lightly, and that parents who sign away their rights have made a legal decision. My father's lawyer withdrew from the case after the press conference, apparently deciding the publicity was no longer beneficial to his practice. But my father wasn't finished. He showed up at my workplace 3 days later, demanding to speak with me. He'd been drinking, despite supposedly being in recovery, and was belligerent with the security guard. When Mrs. Rodriguez called to let me know about the incident, I realized I needed to take a more active role in ending this harassment. I drove to the police station and filed a formal complaint for stalking and harassment. The officer who took my statement had actually been one of the responders to Rick's house during the original raid. "I remember you," he said gently. "Small girl, scared out of your mind. Look at you now." He assured me they would take the complaint seriously, especially given the recent publicity around the case. The restraining order was approved within 48 hours. My father was banned from coming within 500 feet of me, my family, my workplace, or my home, but restraining orders are just pieces of paper. They don't stop desperate people from doing desperate things. The break-in happened on a Tuesday night while David and I were at dinner with friends. We came home to find our front door jimmied open and several items missing. Nothing valuable was taken, just personal items. Photo albums, my college diploma, some jewelry Elena had given me, things that had sentimental value but no monetary worth. The police found my father's fingerprints on my jewelry box. When they arrested him, he had my missing items in his car, along with a handwritten note claiming I owed him $50,000 for pain and suffering. This time, he couldn't talk his way out of consequences. Breaking and entering, violating a restraining order, and theft were serious charges. His public defender advised him to take a plea deal. He was sentenced to 18 months in prison and ordered to stay away from our family for 5 years after his release. As they led him away in handcuffs, he shouted at me across the courtroom. "You'll always be my blood," he yelled. "You can't change that." "Blood doesn't make family," I called back. "Love does." The trial marked the end of his campaign to reinsert himself into my life. Local media covered his sentencing, closing the chapter on his false narrative about stolen children and systemic injustice. But the damage had been done in smaller ways. My work with Child Protective Services became more challenging as some community members questioned my objectivity. I decided to transfer to a position with a nonprofit organization that helped transition foster children to independence. The new job felt like coming full circle. I worked with teenagers aging out of the system, helping them access education, find housing, and build the life skills they'd need as adults. Many of them had stories similar to mine. Parents who'd chosen addiction over responsibility, children who'd learned to survive in impossible circumstances, young people who needed someone to believe in their potential. Elena and Carlos recovered from the legal stress, but the experience had aged them. We started having weekly family dinners, making sure everyone stayed connected and supported. David and I bought a house in their neighborhood, close enough to help with anything they needed. We planted a garden together, creating something beautiful and sustainable. On the first anniversary of our wedding, we had a small celebration at the Martinez house. The same people who defended me during my father's attack gathered to celebrate the life we'd built together. Mrs. Chen brought homemade dumplings and told stories about her own journey to America. Maria announced her engagement to her longtime boyfriend. Carlos had taught David to make tamales, and they spent the afternoon in the kitchen competing over whose were better. As the evening wound down, Elena pulled me aside. "I want you to know something," she said, taking my hands in hers. "When we first met you, you were so angry at the world, at adults, at the unfairness of everything. I worried we'd never be able to reach you." I remembered those early days, the rage that had sustained me through Rick's house but had threatened to consume me once I was safe. What changed? I asked. You did, she smiled. You chose healing over anger. You chose building over destroying. You chose love even when love had failed you before. That night, as David and I walked home under the stars, I thought about the little girl who'd been sold for drug money. She'd survived because she'd learned that some people could be trusted, that some adults kept their promises, that some families chose each other. My father had demanded payment for damage he'd caused. Instead, I'd spent years paying forward the love that had saved me. Every teenager I helped transition from foster care to independence was a victory over the system that had failed me. Every family I helped reunite was proof that healing was possible. Every child I helped find safety was my real legacy. The court case had forced me to relive my worst memories, but it had also shown me how far I'd traveled from that scared 7-year-old. I'd built a life that no one could steal, a family that no one could destroy, a purpose that no one could diminish. My father had tried to sell my story for profit, but the real story wasn't his to sell. It belonged to me, to Elena and Carlos, to the community that had rallied around truth, to the children who would benefit from everything I'd learned. Some stories are about revenge, others are about justice. The best stories are about healing, and that's the only ending that mattered. A year later, I received a letter from my father in prison. I read it once and threw it away without responding. Some chapters deserve to end, and some people deserve to be forgotten. But I kept a photo on my desk from our anniversary dinner. The whole family gathered around Elena's kitchen table, laughing at some joke Carlos had told. It reminded me every day that the best families are the ones you choose, and the best love is the kind that sees you as priceless. That 7-year-old girl who'd been sold for $200 had grown into a woman who couldn't be bought at any price, and that was the only accounting that mattered. But life had one more surprise waiting for me. 3 years after my father's sentencing, I got a call that changed everything again. It was from Detective Morrison, the officer who'd originally responded to Rick's house during the raid. "I need you to come down to the station," he said. "We've reopened the investigation into Rick's operation. Found some things you need to know about." David drove me to the police station, both of us confused about why they'd want to revisit a case that had been closed for over 15 years. Detective Morrison met us in the lobby, looking older but still sharp. "We arrested Rick again last month," he explained as he led us to an interview room. "Different charges, but when we searched his current place, we found something that connects to your case." He showed us a box of photographs and documents. My hands shook as I recognized some of the images. Pictures of me and the other children at Rick's house, but also photos I'd never seen before. "Rick kept records of every transaction," Detective Morrison said carefully. "Not just the drugs, the children too." I felt sick as he explained what they'd discovered. Rick hadn't just been running a drug operation using children as workers. He'd been selling children to other people for different purposes, some for labor, some for adoption scams, some for things Detective Morrison didn't want to specify. "Your father wasn't Rick's only supplier," he said gently. "We've identified at least 12 other parents who sold their children to Rick over a 10-year period." The room spun around me. David's hand found mine as Detective Morrison continued. "But here's what you need to know about your specific case. Your father didn't sell you for $200. He sold you for $2,000, and he came back." The detective showed me transaction records in Rick's handwriting. My father had visited Rick's house 6 times over the 2 years I was there, not to check on me, but to collect additional payments. "Rick was essentially renting you to other people," Detective Morrison explained. "Your father got a percentage every time. The $200 was just the initial down payment." I stared at the documents, trying to process what I was hearing. My father hadn't just abandoned me once. He'd been actively profiting from my abuse for 2 years. "There's more," Detective Morrison said, pulling out another file. "Rick kept videos, not for his own purposes, but as insurance against the parents who sold him children. He recorded every transaction, every pickup, every conversation." My stomach lurched. "Are there videos of my father?" "Yes, and we need you to identify him in them for our case against Rick. But I want you to know what you'll be seeing before you agree to watch them." The videos showed my father negotiating my sale like a business transaction, haggling over price, discussing my value as a worker, even asking Rick to take photos of me to prove I was healthy and useful. In one video, taken 6 months after he'd left me there, my father complained to Rick that I wasn't generating enough income. He suggested Rick be more creative with how he used me. David left the room during that video. I heard him being sick in the hallway bathroom. But the worst part was seeing my 7-year-old self in the background of some videos, thin, scared, doing whatever Rick told me to do while my father watched and discussed my monetary value. "I'm sorry you had to see that," Detective Morrison said after we finished, "but your identification helps us prosecute Rick for human trafficking charges. He'll never hurt another child." The new charges against Rick carried a life sentence. My testimony, combined with the evidence from his records, guaranteed he'd never be released from prison. But the revelation about my father's deeper involvement changed something fundamental in how I saw my own story. I'd spent years believing he'd made one terrible decision while desperate and addicted. Learning that he'd actively profited from my suffering for 2 years shattered even the small kernel of pity I'd maintained for him. That night, David and I sat in our kitchen processing everything we'd learned. "I keep thinking about the wedding," I said. "When he claimed he deserved money for investing in my early years, he wasn't just delusional. He was remembering how much money I'd actually made him." David was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, "Does this change anything for you? About forgiveness or moving forward?" I thought about it carefully. It makes me realize I was never really forgiving him. I was forgiving a version of him him that didn't exist, someone who'd made one desperate mistake instead of someone who'd systematically exploited his own child. The truth was somehow liberating. I'd been carrying guilt about cutting my father out of my life, wondering if I was being too harsh. Now I knew I'd been protecting myself from someone truly dangerous. Elena and Carlos were devastated when I told them about the videos. Carlos actually cried, something I'd only seen him do once before, at my college graduation. That poor little girl, Elena whispered, holding my old school photos. You were just a baby. But Mrs. Chen surprised me with her reaction. When I told her about the new evidence, she nodded grimly. I knew there was something wrong with that man from the beginning, she said. Evil has a smell. I could sense it on him. The new case against Rick made local news, but this time the coverage focused on the trafficking aspect rather than my personal story. I was referred to only as Victim A in court documents, protecting my privacy. My father tried to get involved in the media coverage again, calling reporters from prison to claim he was also a victim of Rick's manipulation, but no one was interested in his version of events anymore. The prosecutor in Rick's case called me to discuss a victim impact statement. Unlike my father's recent trial, where I'd been defending myself, this felt like an opportunity to speak for all the children who'd been hurt by Rick's operation. I spent weeks writing the statement, trying to capture not just my own experience, but what I'd learned from working with other survivors. Rick didn't just steal our childhoods, I read to the court. He stole our ability to trust, to feel safe, to believe that adults would protect us. But he didn't steal our ability to heal, to grow, and to protect other children from predators like him. Rick sat at the defendant's table looking older and smaller than I remembered. He avoided eye contact throughout my statement, but I could see him flinching at certain details. When I finished, the judge thanked me for my courage and sentenced Rick to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Walking out of that courtroom felt different than leaving my father's trial. This time, I wasn't just protecting myself from someone who wanted to use me. I was ensuring that a truly dangerous predator could never hurt another child. The experience inspired me to make a career change. I left my job with the nonprofit and enrolled in law school, specializing in cases involving child exploitation and human trafficking. Elena worried that revisiting trauma through legal work would be harmful, but I found the opposite was true. Understanding the legal system that had failed to protect me as a child gave me tools to protect other children more effectively. Law school was challenging but rewarding. My classmates were impressed by my practical experience with child welfare cases, and professors encouraged me to consider prosecution work. During my second year, I was invited to speak at a conference about human trafficking. My story had become part of training materials for law enforcement officers learning to identify trafficking victims. After my presentation, a woman approached me in the hallway. She was about my age, professionally dressed, with kind eyes that looked familiar. "Excuse me," she said nervously. "I think I know you. Were you at Rick's house in 2008? My heart stopped. It was Sarah, one of the other children from Rick's basement. We'd spoken on the phone during my father's trial, but had never met in person as adults. "I've been following your case," she said. "What you've done, testifying against Rick and your father, fighting back. It inspired me to finally deal with my own trauma." Sarah told me she'd become a teacher, working specifically with at-risk children. Like me, she'd channeled her survival into protecting others. "I've been thinking," she said. "There were 4 of us in that house. You, me, Jake, and Marcus. Have you ever wondered what happened to Marcus?" I had wondered. Jake had been easy to find through social media, and Sarah had reached out during my father's trial. But Marcus had been the youngest, only 5 when the raid happened. None of us had been able to locate him. Sarah had been searching more systematically. She'd hired a private investigator and found something disturbing. Marcus had been adopted after leaving Rick's house, but the adoption had been dissolved when he was 10. He'd bounced through multiple foster homes, aged out of the system at 18, and had been arrested several times for drug-related offenses. "He's in county jail right now," Sarah said quietly. "Has been for 6 months. I think the trauma broke something in him that never healed." That night, I couldn't sleep. While Sarah and Jake and I had found ways to transform our trauma into purpose, Marcus had been consumed by it. I started visiting Marcus in jail. The little boy I remembered as shy and sweet had grown into a man whose eyes held too much pain. He was thin, guarded, and initially suspicious of my motives. "What do you want?" he asked during our first visit. "You here to write a book about the sad foster kid?" I told him about my own journey, about the dark years after Rick's house when I could barely function, about Elena and Carlos, law school, the work I was doing now. "Some people get lucky," he said bitterly. "Some people get families who give a shit. Some of us just get more trauma." He wasn't wrong. The system that had connected me with the Martinez family had failed Marcus repeatedly. His adoption had been disrupted when his new parents decided they couldn't handle his behavioral issues. Multiple foster placements had ended with him being labeled a problem child. I started bringing him books, helping him prepare for his GED, and connecting him with resources for when he was released. Slowly, he began to trust me. "I remember you," he said during one visit. "You used to tell us stories at night when Rick was passed out, made up adventures about kids who escaped to magical places." I'd forgotten about those stories. In Rick's basement, I'd tried to give the younger children something hopeful to think about during the worst moments. "You saved my sanity back then," Marcus continued. "Now you're trying to save my life. Why?" "Because we survived together," I said simply. "That means something." Marcus was released 6 months later. I'd arranged for him to stay in a halfway house and enrolled him in a community college program. He was clean, focused, and determined determined to build a different life. At his graduation ceremony, he asked me to sit in the family section. It was just him and me in that row, but it felt full. "I want to do what you do," he told me afterward. "Help kids who got dealt a bad hand." Marcus enrolled in social work school with my recommendation and financial support. He had a unique ability to connect with the most difficult cases, kids who reminded caseworkers of their own trauma. Sarah started a support group for survivors of child trafficking. We met monthly, sharing resources and supporting each other through the ongoing work of healing. Jake moved back from Arizona and became our fourth member. He'd been working construction but decided to pursue a career in law enforcement, specifically focusing on crimes against children. "We're like a weird family," Sarah observed during one meeting, "bonded by the worst experience any of us ever had, but somehow making it into something positive." The four of us testified together when Rick came up for his first parole hearing. Even though he'd been sentenced to life without parole, the system required periodic reviews. Sitting together in that courtroom, I realized how far we'd all traveled from those scared children in Rick's basement. We'd become advocates, protectors, healers. Everything Rick had tried to destroy in us had grown back stronger. Rick's parole was denied unanimously. The parole board chair said they'd never seen such compelling testimony about the long-term impact of trafficking crimes. 5 years after law school graduation, I opened my own practice specializing in cases involving exploited children. Marcus joined me as a victim advocate. Sarah referred families who needed legal help. Jake provided law enforcement perspective on building cases. Elena and Carlos attended my office opening ceremony, beaming with pride as I cut the ribbon. Mrs. Chen brought homemade cookies and told everyone who would listen about watching me grow up. "That little girl used to have nightmares every night," she announced to my new colleagues. "Look at her now, saving other children from the same monsters." David surprised me that evening with a photo album he'd been secretly creating. Pictures of my journey from that first day with Elena and Carlos to the opening of my practice. Evidence of a life rebuilt from the wreckage of childhood trauma. "You've become exactly who you were meant to be," he said as we looked through the photos together. But the most meaningful moment came when Marcus brought me his first client, a 12-year-old girl who'd been trafficked by her mother's boyfriend. She sat in my office, scared and defensive, reminding me of myself at that age. "This is Ms. Rodriguez," Marcus told her gently. "She understands what happened to you because it happened to her too. She's going to help make sure the people who hurt you face consequences." The girl looked at me with eyes that had seen too much. "Did they really go to jail?" she asked. "They really did," I assured her. "And the people who hurt you will too." Working her case, I realized I'd come full circle. The scared 7-year-old who'd been sold by her father had grown into a lawyer who could ensure other children's voices were heard in court. My father's parole hearing was scheduled for the following year. He'd served his minimum sentence and was eligible for release with conditions. I prepared my victim impact statement months in advance, knowing this might be my last opportunity to speak about his crimes in a legal setting. "Some people deserve second chances," I plan to tell the parole board, "but second chances have to be earned through genuine accountability and change." My father has never acknowledged the full extent of his crimes. He continues to see himself as a victim rather than a perpetrator. Releasing him would endanger other vulnerable children. But 3 weeks before the hearing, I received a call from the prison chaplain. My father had died of a heart attack in his cell. No family had been notified because he'd listed no emergency contact. I felt nothing at first. No grief, no relief, just numbness. David asked if I wanted to attend the funeral, but there wasn't one. The state cremated him after no one claimed his body. Is that sad, or is that justice? I asked Elena during our weekly dinner. "It's just the end of his story," she said wisely. "Your story keeps going." She was right. My story had stopped being about him years ago. It had become about the children I'd helped, the family I'd chosen, the love I'd built from the wreckage he'd created. That weekend, Sarah, Marcus, Jake, and I held our own memorial service. Not for my father, but for the children we'd been before Rick's house. We buried symbolic items in Elena's garden and planted a tree. "We survived," Sarah said as we patted dirt around the new sapling. "We thrived. We became protectors instead of victims." Standing in that garden with my chosen family, I realized the little girl who'd been sold for $200 had finally become priceless, not because of what she'd endured, but because of what she'd chosen to build from her survival. The tree would grow strong in soil, enriched by love, and tended by people who chose each other, just like the family that had grown around the ruins of my childhood. Some stories end with revenge, others end with justice. The best stories end with healing, hope, and the unshakable knowledge that love multiplies when you give it away. My father had tried to define my worth in dollars. I'd learned to measure it in lives changed, children protected, and families formed through choice rather than chance. That was the only accounting that mattered.